This is for September 21st, 2020. This is the beginning of Lesson 6. You are reminded that when we have finished this lesson, we will need to have a quiz. Because this is homecoming week and we have a couple of unusual schedules, I don't expect that quiz until, say, next Wednesday of the following week. In 1774, because of the Intolerable Acts, 12 colonies are going to meet in Philadelphia to respond to what the British had done with the Coercive Acts. How should the colonists fight against it? Well, between 1774 and 1775, when they would meet again, both the British and the American colonists are going to prepare for war. Various states or colonies had been training their militia. They had been training their militia in fear that the British would use their military to suppress basic human rights. The citizen soldier became known for the militia. They were called Minutemen. Now, the way it was supposed to work, if you were a member of the militia, a Minuteman, you would hear the beat of the drum. And when you heard the beat of the drum, that was your call to go to the village square, and there you would muster. The captain would take roll and then inform you why you have been called. Well, in April of 1775, the British, who had spies, had learned that there was a large contingent of weapons in Concord, Massachusetts, and that Sam Adams, and I emphasize Sam Adams, and John Hancock were in Lexington. It was decided in April that the British Army would move out, arrest and capture Adams and Hancock, go on to Concord, and seize the arms. Now, the Americans had spies as well, and the Americans got wind of this, and a series of riders got on the outskirts of Boston. Now, the signal was to come from the Old North Church. If the British were coming by land, there would be one light. If they were coming by sea, in other words, they were being ferried across the Charles River, there would be two lights in the belfry. Well, two lights were seen, and these citizens began to ride through the countryside, alerting the public that the British were coming. Now, of course, almost 50 years after this event, the Harvard-educated poet Longfellow will write about Paul Revere and his midnight ride. But Paul Revere was not the only person to go through the countryside alerting that the British were coming. As the British troops approached Lexington, the militia had been called forward. The leader of the British, Major Pitcairn, ordered the American militia to disperse. Now, we don't know if the Americans fired first or the British fired first. What we do know is that both sides fired a volley. And when it was over, several of the American militiamen lay dead on the ground. Adams and Hancock were nowhere to be seen. The British regulars continued to Concord. Now, to get to Concord, you would have to cross the Old North Bridge. And the colonists were waiting at the Old North Bridge and fired several volleys into the British. Now the British have lost a sizable number, and it is what became known as the shots heard round the world. Tensions continued to rise in Boston, and by the summer of 1775, American militiamen went on the offensive. They fortified Breed's Hill. Now, the British, as they figured out their orders, got the name of the hill wrong and called it Bunker Hill. Now, the leader of the British was Thomas Gage, and Thomas Gage said that those colonists were not going to stay on top of the hill and threaten his ships. So he ordered an advance of British troops to throw the Americans off. The first wave did nothing. The second wave saw both sides lose sizable numbers. By the time the British tried the third wave, the Americans were out of ammunition and were forced to give up the hill. Now, this was an extremely costly victory by the British. And the question was, what do we do next? Now, this video talks about Bunker Hill, but I don't want to show it because I'm afraid that we would have our video refused by YouTube. In the summer of 1775, when the Second Continental Congress met, there were really two decisions to be made. Decision number one, should we kiss and make up with the British? And there were many colonists who said yes. And Congress proposed and passed the Olive Branch Petition. Now, you can see from the information that is on that just about everybody signed it. You can see John Hancock's signature up at the very top. But Congress also decided to create a Continental Army. Now, a Continental Army would be soldiers from all 13 colonies that would be under the command of a military leader. George Washington, who was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, was selected to be the general. Washington will leave the conference and head to Boston, Massachusetts to figure out what to do next. Now, in the fall and winter of 1775, the British militia, the British Army and the militia will have pitched battles. By 1776, the Congress decided that they had had enough and they were ready to vote for independence. Now, 3 men were asked to draft the Declaration of Independence. They were Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, John Adams from Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. It was decided that Jefferson would have the first whack at writing the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson decided that he would base the first half of the Declaration on the British political philosopher John Locke and David Hume. Now, both Locke and Hume had written the British Bill of Rights. Jefferson decided that the Declaration would be divided into 4 parts. Part number 1 would be the rights of man, that all men are created equal. Now, if you're going to take notes, it's important to remind yourself that Jefferson said all men. He did not exclude Negroes from this group. The second part of the Declaration talks about the injustices brought on by the king. Jefferson blamed the king for everything. Part 3 talks about how the colonists are going to try to solve the problem before a military action was taken. And the fourth part, the part that was read the most, was as a free and independent country, this is what we can do. The members were asked to look at the document. Many of them objected to some of the phrases that Jefferson had used in the first section, but eventually they agreed and they voted on July the 2nd that the Declaration should stand approved. Over the course of the next couple of months, the Declaration was read to the Continental Army. It was published and placed so that others could read it. A copy was sent to the King of England, George III. One copy was kept within the United States. Now, that is if you were to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They have the Declaration of Independence on display. This video talks about the importance of the Declaration. Finally, on July the 4th, 12 of the colonies voted for independence, and they started to come up and sign the document. Now, because we are officially at war, because we have declared our independence, Now we have to decide, are we going to fight for the colonists? Are we going to fight for the British? Now, those who chose to fight for the British were called loyalists or Tories. Now, the Tory was the political party that at the moment was the leader of Parliament, and loyalist obviously would be loyal to the crown. We're going to find that those wealthy landowners in the middle colonies, those plantation owners in the south, viewed themselves as loyalists. The farther north you got, the less and fewer loyalists you found. Now, those who wanted independence were called patriots or rebels. So between 1776 and 1782, when the war officially ended, those people in the United States, as they were calling themselves, had to decide, do they side with England or do they side with the rebels? Now again, the rebels were found mostly in the New England area. Most of the non-English, particularly the Germans in the middle colonies, supported the colonies and their drive for independence as well. The Bunker Hill had brought about the idea that a quick war would be unrealistic. And after Bunker Hill, both sides are going to start to raise the number of men. Now, in 1776, the British will be forced out of Boston and will then travel to New York. New York City will become the home base for the British Army for the rest of the war. Well, what are the advantages of the British Army? Well, first of all, size. The British Army far outnumbered the American Army. 2, training. The British Army were extremely well trained. 3, supplies. The British Army had food, they had guns, they had everything needed. And I guess the biggest advantage for the British Army was they had a ready supply of cash. The advantages for the colonial army is they would be fighting on their home turf. They knew the land better than the British. For the Americans, it was do or die. If they did not win the war, then those who had supported the drive for independence would all be executed. The biggest disadvantage for the colonial army was the fact that the colonial army did not have a colonial navy. There were no ships in the American Navy at this time. Secondly, the colonial army was based on the militia. Now, the problem with the militia is the militia of Massachusetts would not go into another state to fight the battles. They just wanted to stay in their state. And so the army, the Continental Army, became more and more important. Now, the biggest disadvantage for the British Army is they would have to travel across the ocean to resupply. They would have to travel across the ocean to bring more troops who had been killed or exhausted by the war. Now, this is a map of the various battle sites, and it will be important that you know the names of each of the red X's. Now, in addition to that, you will need to know who is the American commander and who is the British commander and what were the results of the war. Now, we will start with the battles following the British abandonment of Boston tomorrow. Reminder, tomorrow is a day where we have our Queen crowning and a Mass.